Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the beginning of Unit 9 with Ronald Reagan and conservatism, and today we are talking about the end of the Cold War and a changing economy. So if you are ready, let's begin. The Cold War ends around 1990, 1991, and we need to understand how that happens. And one of the main people that does that is US President Ronald Reagan. He gets a lot of credit for that. He is president, if you remember, from 1980 to 1988, and he does a lot to assert the US opposition to communism, to again explain or show why the US is opposed to communism. And he does this in a number of ways that we'll look at. The first is through his speeches. Ronald Reagan is a very famous speaker. He has a lot of speeches that are very well known about the U.S. opposition to communism, and a lot of lines in those speeches that you'll hear repeated. One of those lines is Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and he is referring to the leader of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, and the Berlin Wall, which separated East and West Berlin, and which on the East Berlin, the Soviet Union was in charge of, and West Berlin, America and its allies were in charge of. And the Berlin Wall became a big symbol of the Cold War. So that was a very famous line. When the Cold War falls down, that is often thought of as the end of the Cold War. And he also calls the Soviet Union an evil empire again. So this is very strong language that Reagan uses to assert the U.S. opposition against communism. So more ways Reagan does this is through limited military interventions, like he overthrows the communist government in Grenada, the buildup of nuclear and conventional weapons. So Reagan does a lot to have more nuclear weapons, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which is sometimes nicknamed Star Wars. And this is the idea to have a way to destroy nuclear weapons as they're being launched from an opposing country. It never actually worked, but it was a really good propaganda tool, and it was used to show kind of how America was able to militarily and scientifically advance further than the Soviet Union, even though it never really came to fruition. So more ideas about what contributed to the end of the Cold War. Well, the U.S. is going to continue spending more and more on the military that the Soviet Union just isn't able to keep up with. Okay, so the Soviet Union's economy starts to struggle. And because they want to keep up militarily spending, they keep spending so much money to try to keep up with the U.S., and it's just not possible for the Soviet Union. Reagan also is very good at diplomacy. He has a strong relationship with Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev, like we talked about, and is very direct with him as well. As I've just recently mentioned, there's a lot of political and economic issues in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. There are countries like Hungary that are going through revolutions, that are trying to revolt against the Soviet Union, and all these little mini rebellions, and also the weakness of the economy in the Soviet Union eventually helps lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And last, Gorbachev, the last major leader of the Soviet Union, has these ideas called glasnost and perestroika. Okay, so let's understand those words. Let's write those down. Essentially, what those are is basically the Soviet Union being more open to capitalist ideas and to other countries, and their economic and political reforms, and those lead eventually to the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1991. All right, last for this idea, what is the impact of the end of the Cold War? Well, there's a lot of new diplomatic relationships that form. We see the expansion of NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a system of alliances you can see pictured here on the top right picture that America and its allies promise to defend each other. So that becomes a really strong alliance system. The United Nations is also another important impact. It's going to be used for peacekeeping interventions after the Cold War. So this is a really important thing to know of. For example, they're used in Iraq in 1991, and they're used in Yugoslavia, as you can see pictured on the bottom right, in the Yugoslav wars in the Balkans, which is an area in Europe. So the United Nations, again, is being one of the impacts of Cold War is that the United Nations is now being used for peacekeeping interventions. And the last major impact of the Cold War is that America and the world is now debating, well, what's the role now for America? America just spent all this time post World War II to now in this fight against communism. And that was really America's sole foreign policy. And now that communism has pretty much been defeated and the Soviet Union is collapsing, well, what should America do? Is America on top? Should America still be interventionist? Should they go back to being isolationist? There's a lot of debates over what America should do. All right, the next topic we want to talk about, shifting gears after the Cold War, is the economy and the changing economy that takes place during the 80s, 90s, and today. And we want to know this main first idea is really important. So America is going to start to participate in worldwide economic opportunities. And it's going to be much less focused just on American economy, but a world economy. So this is this idea that we need to know this term, globalization, that the economy now becomes a truly global economy. You're buying things from all over the world. You're selling things from all over the world. People are communicating very quickly. We see our productivity increase, the invention of computers and email and the advent of telephones, that had already been invented, but now they're more widespread, all this kind of stuff, right? It's going to connect the world in an instant way. Communication is going to increase, and it's going to make the economy more global, and it's going to increase quicker. And so another impact of this new economy is the technology. And what's the impact of the technology that we're getting with computers and with the internet is this increased access to information. A lot of print newspapers start to be shut down, and we see they're being replaced with website news, digital news. Okay. We also see new social networks, social behaviors, right? If you think about how people communicate with each other now, it's a lot of time through social networks, okay, social media. And that's where a lot of people are now getting access to information, which is very different than it used to be. So this is one major change in the economy because of the technology. And the last thing that we'll talk about today is more about the economy post 1980 and kind of what ends up happening with the economy. So one major thing we need to know that under Ronald Reagan and into the 90s and early 2000s, this is an important concept. The wages are going to stagnate for the low to middle class. So we see the wealthy upper class continue to make more and more money, but the lower and middle class are kind of staying at the same amount of money or the same percentage of money. Okay. And because of this, there's an increase in economic inequality. We start to see the rich being very, very, very rich. These are the Bill Gateses of the world, right? And everyone else kind of struggling on. Another change with the economy is that in America, we see a increase in what's called service sector jobs. And these are jobs where you're not producing anything, but you are doing a service. These are jobs like nursing or teaching or tourism. These are service sector jobs, and the amount of those jobs increase. And because of that increase and because of globalization, we see the decrease in manufacturing jobs, the decrease of traditional union jobs. And that ends up with a decline in what we think of as called the Rust Belt. And you can see that in this picture here. These are northern cities like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit that used to be major centers of manufacturing, but a lot of those jobs were now moved overseas thanks to globalization. And so a lot of people lost their jobs in those areas. And I just want to show you this one map to drive home that point of the growing economic inequality. So this dark blue line is a measure of the productivity. And the light blue line is a measure of the real median family income, so like the average family income. And you can see that productivity in the 80s continues to go up and up and up, but family income does not change as much as productivity does. So this is where we see that wealth inequality come about. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the end of the Cold War and the idea of a changing economy in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. So let's sum up with our big ideas. Number one, describe the different reasons the Cold War ended and be specific about one. Number two, explain how technology helped increase productivity. And number three, explain how the post-1980 economy affected the middle class. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for our last homework video of the year. Awesome. Thank you.